2 world wars, 4 great armies, 1 design. The machine guns that faced each other across the mud of the Western Front, the German gun and the British gun, firing into each other's ranks for 4 years, were built from the same patent, drawn by the same hand. Both sides paid for the privilege. The man who drew it was not a soldier, not a general, and not a gunsmith. He was a self-taught mechanic from a village in Maine who had spent his best years building electric lights and lost the credit for them to Thomas Edison. His own country did not want his gun. The United States Army looked at it and said no, so he took it to London. Within 15 years, his design had armed the British Empire, cut down thousands of warriors at a river in Rhodesia, killed roughly 12,000 men in a single morning outside a city on the Nile, and been bought, in one form or another, by nearly every government in Europe. He was knighted for it. The salesman who sold it became one of the richest men on earth. And in November of 1916, while guns built from his design were killing a generation in France, he died in a house in South London, his name already being quietly erased from the company he had founded. This is the story of how one man's design armed the world, who signed the deals, who took the money, and what every one of those deals actually cost. Chapter 1. The Mechanic from Maine. He was born on the 5th of February, 1840, in Sangerville, Maine, and by the standards of the industry he would eventually reshape, he had no business being anywhere near it. He had almost no schooling. The figure most often cited is less than 5 years of formal education in a farming township where a boy's labor was worth more than his attendance. What he had instead was his hands and a particular kind of attention. He looked at machines the way other people looked at words on a page. He took them apart, understood why they worked, and understood, more usefully, why they failed. At 14, he was apprenticed to a carriage maker. His first real wages, by his own account, came to about $4 a month and were paid partly in trade goods rather than cash. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The man who would one day be knighted by a British king and whose design would be bought by nearly every army in Europe began his working life earning the equivalent of a few dollars a month building wheels and axles in rural Maine. He came up inside a particular culture, the self-taught mechanic culture of 19th century New England, and it shaped both his strengths and his limits. It was a culture that produced extraordinary practical ingenuity, men who could look at a machine and see how to make it better without ever having read a textbook of engineering, because the workshop and the trade were their entire education. It was also a culture with no ladder into ownership. A mechanic learned to serve the men who owned the mills, the shops, and the patents. The skills it taught were the skills of building and fixing, not the skills of financing, promoting, and controlling an enterprise, and Maxim absorbed the first set completely and the second hardly at all. He would go through life as one of the most capable builders of his age and one of the least effective owners, and the imbalance was set early, in a Maine workshop, long before he ever saw a gun. He drifted through the trades, a self-taught mechanic drifted through in 19th century New England. Coachwork, a machine shop run by an uncle, instrument making, drafting. He was, in the language of the period, a mechanic, and the word carried none of the prestige that engineer would later carry. A mechanic was a man who fixed and built things with his own hands for other men who owned the enterprise. That distinction would follow him his entire life. He was always the man who could build the thing. He was rarely the man who owned it. His first patent came in 1866. He was 26. It was not a weapon, not an engine, and not anything that hinted at the direction his life would take. It was a hair-curling iron. Over the following decade, the patents accumulated in exactly the scattered, restless pattern one would expect from a man teaching himself invention with no institution behind him. A mousetrap, a device for a locomotive headlight, engine governors, gas apparatus, a machine for producing illuminating gas, a steam pump, a sprinkler system. By the time he was done, he would hold, by the count that survives, roughly 122 United States patents and about 149 British ones. He invented the way some men gamble, compulsively and across every table in the room. The mousetrap is worth pausing on, because it reveals what kind of inventor he was. It was, by the accounts, an automatic trap, one that reset itself, a small mechanical demonstration of the same instinct that would later produce the gun, the instinct to make a machine repeat an action without a human hand to reset it each time. He was drawn, again and again, to the problem of self-repeating mechanism, of the device that runs its own cycle. In a mousetrap, that instinct is a curiosity. In a firearm, it would reshape the century. But in the 1870s, it earned him a modest living and nothing more. Because a clever mousetrap, however self-resetting, is sold into a market of pennies. He was applying a first-rate mind to fourth-rate stakes, not because he lacked ambition, but because he had not yet found the market that would pay first-rate money for exactly the thing he did best. Here's what matters about that period, told through the business lens rather than the biographical one. None of it made him rich. A man can hold a great many patents and still be, in the terms that count, a contractor. He was producing value and watching other men capture it. The mousetrap did not make him wealthy. The gas machine did not make him wealthy. He was a supplier of cleverness to enterprises owned by other people. And cleverness, sold that way, is a commodity like any other. It is bought cheaply and it does not compound. That was the trap he was in by the middle of the 1870s. He was undeniably capable. Contemporaries who dealt with him did not dispute that he could build almost anything he set his mind to. But capability is not the same as ownership, and by his mid-30s he had a great deal of the first and almost none of the second. Then came the technology that should have made him. In the late 1870s, the race was on to produce a workable, incandescent electric light, and Maxim, by then working in New York, threw himself into it. He was not a bystander to that revolution. He was inside it. And the collision it set up would teach him a lesson so bitter that it arguably explains everything he did afterward, including why he left the country. The lesson was this: being the man who can build it counts for very little if someone else owns the story of who built it. He was about to lose that lesson's first and most famous round, and lose it to the most effective self-promoter of the age. Chapter 2. The Man Edison Erased. By 1878, the mechanic from Maine had a real title for the first time. He was chief engineer of the newly formed United States Electric Lighting Company, one of the earliest firms in the world organized specifically to sell electric light. This was the closest he had yet come to the center of something large. He did serious work there. In 1878, he developed a method for manufacturing carbon filaments, the fragile, burning heart of the incandescent bulb, and he was among the small handful of men in the world capable of making an electric lamp actually work. He installed one of the first electric lighting systems in a major New York building, the Equitable Life Building at 120 Broadway, at a time when most of the city still ran on gas. He was, by any technical measure, a genuine pioneer of electric light. Not the pioneer, but genuinely one of them. The problem was the other man in the race. Thomas Edison was not a better inventor than Maxim in any simple sense, and on certain narrow technical points, Maxim believed, to the end of his life, that he had gotten there first, or gotten there better. Whether or not those specific priority claims can be independently confirmed, the production numbers of the argument are not really in dispute on one point. Edison won the part of the contest that determined who history would remember. Edison understood something Maxim did not. He understood that the invention was only half the product. The other half was the narrative, the demonstration, the press, the financing, the name stamped on the public imagination. Edison built a machine for manufacturing credit as efficiently as he built one for manufacturing light. Maxim built the light. Edison built the legend. Only one of those compounds. The resentment that came out of this went deep and lasted for the rest of Maxim's life. Accounts of him consistently describe a man who remained, in the words of one, always disgusted that Edison got the credit. He was not wrong to feel robbed of recognition. He was, on the technical merits, one of the fathers of the electric light. But recognition is not distributed on the technical merits, and he had just learned that at the highest possible cost, in the highest possible arena, against the highest possible opponent. The mechanism of the defeat is worth understanding precisely, because Maxim would spend the rest of his life reacting to it. Edison did not out-invent Maxim so much as out-organize him. He built an apparatus around the invention, a laboratory that generated a stream of demonstrable results, a genius for the press and the public spectacle, and above all, the financing, to carry an idea from the workbench to the market, and to plant his name on it at every stage. The bulb that the public remembered was not necessarily the best bulb. It was the bulb attached to the most effective machine for manufacturing fame and capital. Maxim, working with less money and no comparable instinct for publicity, produced genuine technical results and watched them vanish into another man's legend. He had done the work and lost the credit, which is the precise experience that a patent system is supposed to prevent and routinely fails to prevent, because a patent protects an invention on paper while the market rewards whoever controls the story and the money. That experience left him with a conviction he never abandoned and a wound he never closed. To the end of his life, he insisted on his own priority in electric lighting, and the insistence has the sound of a man relitigating the defining defeat of his early career. But the useful thing he took from it was not the grievance. It was the strategic realization that if merit alone would not win in the American market for invention, then he needed either a different weapon or a different market, and he was about to be handed both. Read as biography, this is a story about a wounded ego. Read as business history, it is something sharper. It is the moment Maxim discovered, in the one field where he had a legitimate claim to greatness, that the American market for invention was not a meritocracy of the workbench. It was a contest of capital and publicity, And in that contest, he had been comprehensively beaten by a man who was, arguably, the better businessman rather than the better mechanic. A man can respond to that lesson in two ways. He can learn to play the game of capital and publicity, or he can go looking for a different game entirely, in a different place, where the rules might favor the thing he was actually good at. Maxim, at around 40, chose the second, and an opportunity to leave was already taking shape. His electrical work had brought him into the orbit of men with European business, and by 1881 there was a proposal on the table to send him across the Atlantic in connection with the electric lighting business, to reorganize company affairs in Europe. On its face, it was a lateral move for a frustrated engineer. In practice, it removed him from the country that had just written him out of the biggest story of the age, and set him down in the one part of the world where his next idea would find not resistance, but a bidding war. The offer that took him out of America was framed as being about electric light. What it led to had nothing to do with light at all. Chapter 3. Cut each other's throats. The terms of the arrangement that pulled Maxim to Europe were, by the standards of a man who had been earning his living as a contract inventor, extraordinary. The figure that comes down through the accounts is a salary in the region of $20,000 a year, plus expenses, to represent the electrical interests abroad. Set that against $4 a month in trade goods as a carriage maker's apprentice, and the entire arc of his American career compresses into two numbers. He had gone from $4 a month to $20,000 a year. He had also gone from the country of his birth to the far side of an ocean, and he was about to abandon the field those dollars were meant to buy. The pivot happened, according to the story Maxim told for the rest of his life, at a gathering in Europe around 1881, most often placed at the Paris exhibition. He fell into conversation with another American, a man who knew the continent and its appetites. Maxim was still talking about electricity, about chemistry, about the technical frontiers he had spent his life chasing. And the man gave him a piece of advice so cold and so accurate that Maxim quoted it, apparently without embarrassment, for decades. Hang your chemistry and electricity. If you want to make a pile of money, invent something that will enable these Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility. That is the sentence the whole story turns on. Strip away the shock of it and look at what it actually is. It is market analysis. The man was not making a moral point or a joke. He was telling Maxim, correctly, that he had been selling into the wrong market his entire life. Light, gas, curling irons, mousetraps. These were consumer and industrial goods sold into competitive markets full of other clever men and other patents. Markets where an Edison could outfinance and outpublicize him. But there was one market on the European continent in 1881 that was different. It was enormous. It was permanent. It never suffered a true recession. Its customers were governments, which do not haggle the way shopkeepers haggle, and it rewarded not incremental improvement but decisive advantage. That market was war. Look at that market the way an analyst would, coldly, on its merits as a market, because that is how the man in Paris was describing it and how Maxim came to see it. Its customers were states, which meant the buyers had access to the deepest pools of capital in existence, the taxing power of nations, and were famously insensitive to price when they believed their survival was at stake. Its demand was structural and permanent, because the powers of Europe existed in a condition of perpetual rivalry, each arming against the others in a race none could afford to lose, so that a genuine advantage sold to one created immediate demand from all the rest. It was, uniquely, a market where the product's effectiveness was measured not in convenience or cost savings, but in decisive advantage over a rival, which meant that a weapon offering a real edge could command a price no ordinary product ever could. And it was a market almost no independent inventor was serving well, because the field was dominated by government arsenals and a few established firms, leaving room for a decisive private breakthrough to command extraordinary attention. Every feature that had made Maxim's earlier markets a trap, the price competition, the substitutes, the indifference of buyers, was reversed here. War was the one market that would pay a fortune for exactly what Maxim did best, and pay it over and over, for as long as the powers feared each other, which was to say, forever. Maxim understood the analysis immediately, because Maxim, whatever else he was not sentimental about where money came from. He had spent 30 years supplying cleverness into markets that captured most of its value for someone else. Here was a man telling him where the uncaptured value actually sat. So he did the arithmetic of the opportunity, and the arithmetic was stark. Consider the state of infantry firepower in 1881. A soldier with a good breech-loading rifle, well-drilled, could manage perhaps 2 or 3 aimed shots in a minute, and could not keep even that up for long before fouling, fatigue, and the sheer mechanical labor of loading each round by hand slowed him down. Every soldier on every battlefield in the world was, in effect, a single-shot device operated by a tiring human being. The rate of fire of an entire army was just the sum of thousands of men, each performing the same slow manual cycle over and over. Maxim looked at that and saw the gap. If one man could be made to deliver not 2 or 3 rounds a minute, but hundreds, then one man could replace dozens, and whichever army possessed that multiplier first would hold an advantage that no amount of courage on the other side could close. That gap was the product. Not a gun, in the way a gunsmith would think of a gun. A multiplier of force, sold to the institutions with the deepest pockets and the least price sensitivity on Earth. He was reportedly not a gun enthusiast. He had, by some accounts, fired a rifle only rarely, and had been struck years earlier by the brutal kick of the recoil against his shoulder. He did not come to the problem as a lover of weapons. He came to it as a mechanic who had just been shown a market and told, correctly, that it was the richest one available and that no one had yet built the thing it most wanted. The arithmetic of that single sentence in Paris became a working machine in roughly 18 months. Chapter 4. Hatton Garden. Maxim took a workshop in London, in the district of Hatton Garden, and set out to build the thing the market wanted. What he produced there over the next year and a half was not an improvement on an existing weapon. It was a different category of object, and the idea at its center was so simple in hindsight that it is worth stating plainly, because the simplicity is the whole business story. Every rapid-fire gun before Maxim required a man to power it. The Gatling gun, the most famous of the earlier designs, could throw out a great many rounds, but only because a soldier stood there turning a crank. The energy that loaded, fired, extracted, and ejected each round came from human muscle. Take away the man turning the handle, and the gun was inert metal. It was, in business terms, a device that still had a person embedded in its core cost structure. Its output was capped by how fast and how long a human arm could crank. Maxim's insight was to remove the man. When a gun fires, the barrel and the mechanism are thrown backward by the recoil, the same brutal kick he had felt in his shoulder years earlier. In every other gun, that energy was waste, absorbed by the shooter and thrown away. Maxim looked at the recoil and saw a power source that fired itself, for free, on every single shot. He designed a mechanism that captured that backward force and used it to do all the work a human had previously done. The recoil ejected the spent cartridge, cocked the mechanism, chambered a fresh round from a fabric belt, and fired again. And the firing produced fresh recoil, which drove the next cycle, and the next. That was the breakthrough, and it was not really a gun. It was a self-feeding cycle. Pull the trigger and hold it, and the weapon would fire, reload itself, and keep firing until the belt ran out or the barrel gave up, entirely under its own power, with no human contribution beyond aiming and holding on. The energy of each shot paid for the next. Once it started, it ran itself. The numbers this produced were, for 1884, almost unbelievable to the men who first saw them. A single Maxim gun, one weapon operated by a small crew, could fire in the region of 500 to 600 rounds a minute. Set that against the 2 or 3 aimed rounds a rifleman could manage. One Maxim gun delivered, from a single position, roughly the sustained firepower of some 30 riflemen. And it did so without the 30 men, without their 30 rifles, and without the collapse in accuracy and morale that 30 frightened men in a line inevitably suffer. Those are not engineering facts. They are business facts. Maxim had built a machine that replaced 30 units of labor with 1 unit of capital equipment. In an industry, war, whose central problem had always been the supply and coordination of human bodies. He had done to the infantryman roughly what the power loom had done to the handweaver, and he had done it in the one industry where the displaced units were not merely unemployed but killed. There were problems, the raw rate of fire concealed, and Maxim, to his credit as a mechanic, solved the important one. A gun firing hundreds of rounds a minute heats up ferociously, and a hot barrel warps, fouls, and eventually fails. Maxim wrapped the barrel in a metal jacket filled with water. The water absorbed the heat and let the gun sustain fire far longer than any air-cooled design of the period could. This mattered enormously in practice, because the value of the weapon was not really its peak rate for a few seconds. It was its ability to keep a wall of fire standing for minutes on end, long enough to break any advance across open ground. The water jacket turned a burst weapon into a sustained one. It turned a demonstration piece into a battlefield instrument. There is a shadow over the origin of that mechanism, and honesty about the record requires naming it, even though it cannot be resolved. In the late 1870s, in Southampton, an engineer and publican named William Cantello was reportedly working, in secret and with his 2 sons, on a rapid-fire gun of his own. Cantello ran an engineering business that at its height is said to have employed as many as 40 people, and beneath his inn, the old tower on Bargate Street, he kept an underground workshop where, by the family's account, he perfected an automatic gun in the early 1880s. Then, at almost exactly the moment his work was said to be finished, Cantello vanished. He left, reportedly to sell his invention abroad, drew a large sum out of his bank account, and was never reliably seen again. His sons, so the story goes, later became convinced that a photograph of the famous Hiram Maxim was in fact a photograph of their missing father, and that the two men were one and the same, or that Maxim had somehow taken Cantello's design. Treat that story with the caution it deserves. It is a legend, not an established fact, and it runs hard against the documented record of Maxim's separate and well-attested life in America and then in London. A later BBC investigation into the claim noted visible differences between the two men and cast serious doubt on any identity swap. Whether or not any connection between Cantello and Maxim can be independently confirmed, and the honest answer is that it cannot, the tale survives for a reason worth naming in a business account. It survives because it dramatizes the exact anxiety this whole story is about. The fear that the man whose name ends up on the product and in the history books is not always the man who did the original work, and that invention, unlike a name, leaves no clear fingerprint on the thing invented. Cantello, if he existed as the story tells it, is the inventor with no credit and no fortune taken to its absolute extreme, a man erased so completely that even his existence became a rumor. Maxim would spend his life fighting a milder version of exactly that erasure. By the mid-1880s, Maxim, by the clear weight of the evidence his own man, had a working, patented, self-powered, water-cooled machine gun, built largely by his own hands in a London workshop, financed at first out of the resources that had brought him across the Atlantic. He had, in other words, done the hard part. He had solved the technical problem that no one before him had solved, and he had solved it alone. Consider what that solitary achievement actually represented in labor terms, because it frames everything that followed. In roughly 18 months, working largely with his own hands and his own money, a man with fewer than 5 years of formal schooling had produced the first genuinely automatic gun in history, a weapon that would render every rapid-fire design before it obsolete and set the template every serious army would follow for the next 70 years. There was no team of engineers, no government arsenal, no research budget. There was one self-taught mechanic in a rented workshop doing the single most consequential piece of weapons engineering of the century. If invention alone determined who prospered, this was the moment Maxim should have secured his fortune and his place beyond all argument. He had, on the merits, earned both. What the rest of his life would demonstrate is that invention alone determines almost nothing about who prospers, and that the man who does the work and the man who keeps the reward are, with painful regularity, two different men. And here the story turns, because solving the technical problem turned out to be the part Maxim was best equipped to do and the part that mattered least to his fortune. He now had to sell it. And the men who could afford to buy it, the professional soldiers and the war ministries of the great powers, were exactly the men least inclined to believe a self-taught American electrician had just rewritten their profession. Chapter 5. The buyer nobody courted. The obvious first customer for an American's machine gun should have been America. It was not. The United States Army, in the 1880s, was a small frontier constabulary with no continental rival, no appetite for expensive, unproven ordnance, and a procurement culture built around thrift. Presented with Maxim's weapon, the American military showed little serious interest. The reasons were not stupid. They were arithmetic. A machine gun that could fire 600 rounds a minute could also consume 600 rounds a minute, and ammunition was expensive, heavy, and hard to move. To a frontier army counting cartridges, a weapon that devoured them at that rate looked less like a breakthrough and more like a logistical liability. The country that had produced Maxim looked at what he had built and, in effect, declined. That refusal is the hinge of the entire story, so it is worth being precise about what it was and what it was not. It was not a verdict that the gun did not work. It was a verdict that the American army, given its situation, could not see why it would pay for one. And it pushed Maxim to do the thing that defines this whole account. He stopped trying to sell to the country that made him, and he turned to the customers who were structurally hungry for exactly what he had built. Those customers were in Europe, and they were of two kinds. There were the war ministries of the great powers, locked in an accelerating arms race with one another. And above and behind them, there was the British Empire, an enterprise that governed a quarter of the planet with a chronically small army, and whose entire strategic problem could be summarized as the need for a few men to control a great many people across enormous distances. To an empire with that problem, a machine that let one man deliver the firepower of 30 was not a luxury. It was the answer to the central question of imperial administration. Maxim understood this. And he understood something else. War ministries do not buy on paper. They buy on spectacle, on the judgment of senior officers who need to see the thing perform with their own eyes. So Maxim became a showman, and this is one of the quiet ironies of his life. Having lost the electric light contest, partly because Edison was the better showman, he now learned to run a demonstration himself. He staged firings of the gun for exactly the audience that could sign the contracts, the officers, the officials, and where he could arrange it, the royalty and titled grandees whose enthusiasm moved procurement decisions in the monarchies of Europe. The demonstrations were effective because the weapon did something no committee report could convey. It stood a wall of fire in the air. It cut down saplings, chewed through targets, and emptied belts of ammunition at a rate that made experienced soldiers go quiet. The gun sold itself in the only language that mattered to its buyers, which was the visible, unarguable evidence of what it would do to men in the open. Maxim's job was simply to get the right people in front of it, and he did. The visitors he got in front of it were, by the accounts of the period, the most influential audience in Europe. From his workshop, reportedly at 57D Hatton Garden and later at the Works, Maxim staged firings for a stream of royalty, generals, and statesmen. The Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII, is recorded firing the gun and lending it his backing. And that patronage was worth more than any technical endorsement, because in the monarchies of the age, the enthusiasm of a prince moved ministries in a way no engineer's report could. Senior soldiers and titled grandees came to watch, and Maxim understood that the demonstration itself was a product to be staged as carefully as the gun was built. By some accounts, he would show off the weapon's precision by using it almost as a pen, controlling the automatic fire so finely that he could cut the initials of a distinguished visitor into a target with a burst of bullets. Whether or not every telling of that trick is exact, the point of it is not marksmanship, it is theater, the demonstration that this terrifying rate of fire was under complete control, which is precisely the reassurance a nervous war ministry needed before it would commit. One visit, widely retold, captures the whole economics of the weapon in a single exchange. The Chinese statesman Li Hongzhang, one of the most powerful officials of the late Qing Empire, is reported to have watched the Maxim gunfire and asked not how many men it could kill, but how much it cost to feed. On being told the rate at which it consumed ammunition, he is said to have remarked that the gun fired too fast for China, that his country could not afford to keep it supplied with cartridges. Whether or not the quotation is word for word accurate, the insight in it is exact, and it is the same insight that had made the United States Army hesitate. The gun's true cost was never the gun. It was the river of ammunition the gun demanded, and only a state with deep enough resources to feed it could truly own one. That was the real barrier to entry, and it is why the weapon belonged, in the end, to the richest empires and not to everyone who admired it. The commercial results followed, though not instantly, and not without the fight the next chapters will describe. Over the years that followed, the British Army moved toward adoption, taking the gun into service around the start of the 1890s. Other powers followed on their own timelines, with Germany adopting a Maxim pattern by the end of the decade. Each adoption was a government, not a shopkeeper, committing to a weapon system, which meant not one sale but a stream of them, guns, spares, and above all, ammunition, for years. Maxim also did something that shows exactly how completely he had chosen his market. He became British. He settled in England, took up residence in South London, and in 1899 was naturalized as a British subject. 2 years later, in 1901, he was knighted. An American carriage maker's apprentice made a knight by the British crown for giving the empire its instrument. The man his own country had ignored had been formally embraced by the country that intended to use what he built. He had not just found a better market, he had changed his nationality to fit it. Weigh that decision as the commercial act it was. A man born in Maine, who had grown up American, who had fought and lost the defining commercial battle of his life on American ground, formally renounced that citizenship and became a subject of the British crown at the age of 59. Sentiment did not drive that choice. The market drove it. Britain was where his product was wanted, where the contracts were signed, where the empire that needed his gun made its decisions, and being British made him a more natural supplier to that empire and a more honorable recipient of its knighthood. He had reorganized his own identity around his customer, the most complete expression imaginable of a man following his market rather than his roots. The United States had produced him and declined his gun. Britain had bought the gun and, in return, took the man. It was, in the end, a fair trade for both of them, and a quietly damning verdict on the country that had let him go. But selling a government a gun once is not the same as owning a position it cannot escape. To turn adoption into something durable, Maxim's weapon had to make its buyers structurally dependent on it. It had to become not a purchase, but a system they could not walk away from. Chapter 6. One Belt of Ammunition. The reason the Maxim gun became an empire's instrument rather than a clever novelty lies in a feature that has nothing to do with how fast it fired. It lies in what firing that fast made everyone around it dependent on. Start with the ammunition. A weapon that consumed rounds at 500 or 600 a minute changed the arithmetic of an army's entire supply chain. In the British case, the gun was chambered for the standard service cartridge of the era, the .303, the same round the infantry rifle used. That decision looks minor, and is not. It meant the machine gun drank from the same ammunition supply the Army was already committed to producing, shipping, and stockpiling by the million. A colonial column marching into the interior did not need a separate logistics tail for its machine guns. It fed them from the same crates that fed the rifles. The gun slotted into a supply system that already existed, which removed the single biggest practical objection to fielding it. That is a lock-in, and it runs in two directions. It made the gun easy for the British to adopt because it demanded nothing new of their supply chain. And once adopted, it made the whole apparatus of ammunition production, the factories, the contracts, the standardized cartridge, part of the same integrated system the gun belonged to. You did not buy a Maxim gun. You bought into an arrangement of standardized ammunition, spare barrels, trained crews, and the industrial base behind them. Walking away from the gun meant unwinding all of it. Then there was the sustained fire capability the water jacket made possible, and what it did to tactics. A weapon that can hold a wall of fire across a field for minutes does not merely add firepower to an existing battle plan, it rewrites the plan. Ground that a machine gun covers becomes ground across which no massed advance in the open can succeed. The gun does not need to hit every man. It needs to make the crossing of a given stretch of ground statistically fatal. And at 600 rounds a minute from a stable, cooled, belt-fed position, it does exactly that. Armies that possessed the gun began, slowly and unevenly, to build their thinking around it. The gun was not a tool inside the strategy. Increasingly, the gun was the strategy. State the reframe plainly. The product Maxim had built was not really a gun. The product was suppression, the ability to deny a piece of ground to human beings, delivered as a reliable, repeatable, industrial service. And the moat around that product was not the cleverness of the mechanism, which competitors would eventually copy. The moat was logistics, standardization, and institutional dependence. Once an army had rebuilt its supply, its tactics, and its training around sustained automatic fire, it could not casually revert to lines of men loading rifles by hand. It was locked in by its own reorganization. There is a second layer to the lock-in, and it sits in the factory rather than on the battlefield. A gun that fires 600 rounds a minute is a precision object under enormous mechanical stress, and building it reliably in quantity is a manufacturing problem of the first order, one that demands interchangeable parts made to fine tolerances by a serious industrial plant. This is exactly the doubt that Maxim's rivals reportedly tried to plant in the minds of officers. The suggestion that a gun built by hand in a workshop could never be mass-produced to a consistent standard. Answering that doubt required not cleverness but capital. The works at Crayford, the machine tools, the skilled workforce, the whole apparatus of industrial production. A lone inventor could build one perfect gun. Only a well-financed company could build 1,000 identical ones and guarantee that each would function in the field. The barrier to competing with Maxim was therefore never really the idea, which others could and did grasp. It was the industrial base needed to turn the idea into a reliable product at scale, and that base cost more than any inventor possessed. Set the cost arithmetic out plainly, because it explains who could play this game and who could not. The customer was buying 3 separate things bundled as one. There was the gun itself, a durable capital item bought once. There was the stream of ammunition, an operating expense that never stopped and that dwarfed the gun's own price over any real campaign. And there was the industrial relationship, the spares, the replacement barrels, the dependence on the maker's factory to keep the weapon in service. A government that adopted the Maxim gun was not making a purchase. It was entering a long-term supply relationship with a specific industrial concern, and the deeper that relationship ran, the harder it became to leave. That is the anatomy of a lock-in, and Maxim's gun had it in every dimension at once, from the cartridge in the belt, to the tactics on the field, to the tooling in the factory. This is why the Maxim pattern spread and endured, while flashier rivals faded. It is also, though Maxim may not have framed it this way, the deepest reason his personal fortune was about to slip out of his hands. He had built something whose value lay in a whole industrial system, factories, contracts, ammunition, distribution across a global empire. And a system of that scale cannot be owned by a lone mechanic in a workshop, however brilliant. It can only be owned by concentrated capital. The very thing that made his gun unstoppable in the field, its integration into a vast industrial and imperial machine, was the thing that guaranteed the men who controlled that machine, and not the man who designed its centerpiece, would capture most of what it earned. The money that turned his workshop into a company had names attached to it. None of those names were his. Chapter 7. The names not on the gun. To turn a workshop into a company, Maxim needed capital, and capital in the London of the 1880s meant a specific set of men. In 1884, the enterprise took formal shape as the Maxim Gun Company, and manufacturing was established in Britain, eventually centered on works at Crayford in Kent. Maxim's name was on the door. His hands had built the prototype. His patents were the whole basis of the business. And from the beginning, he was not the man who controlled it. The capital came from the sort of backers who financed serious industrial ventures. Among the figures associated with the company's financing and direction was Albert Vickers, of the Vickers family, a Sheffield steel and engineering dynasty that would become one of the largest armaments concerns on Earth. Behind the arrangements, too, sat some of the deepest financial resources in Europe, including interests connected to the Rothschild banking house, whose involvement in the wider Maxim enterprise would become explicit within a few years. These were not passive check writers. They were men and institutions accustomed to owning what they financed. Look carefully at the structure, because the structure is the lesson. Maxim contributed the one thing that could not be bought elsewhere, the invention, embodied in his patents and his ability to keep improving the design. But invention, once it exists, is a fixed asset. It has been contributed. It does not renew its bargaining power. Capital, by contrast, is contributed continuously, every time the company needs to expand a factory, fund a demonstration tour, carry inventory, or wait out the long sales cycle of a government contract. The party that must be persuaded to keep contributing holds the leverage, and that party was never Maxim. It was the men with the money. So the arrangement settled into a shape that would define the rest of Maxim's commercial life. He was the technical genius at the center of a company he did not command. He drew a good income, far beyond anything the carriage maker's apprentice could have imagined, and he held a stake. But the controlling interest, the ability to decide the company's direction, to merge it, to restructure it, to determine who sat where and who was eased out, rested with the financiers. He had escaped being a contract inventor supplying cleverness to other men's firms, only to become a salaried and shareholding inventor inside a firm other men controlled. It was a promotion in comfort. It was not a change in the fundamental relationship. The specific backers show how serious the enterprise had become. The Vickers family concern, centered on steel and heavy engineering in Sheffield, was on its way to becoming one of the largest armaments manufacturers in the world, and Albert Vickers was among the figures directing the machine gun venture. Behind such ventures stood banking interests of the first rank, and within a few years the Rothschild house would be explicitly involved in financing the wider Maxim enterprise on a scale reported in the millions of pounds. These were not men who put money into a business in order to sit quietly while an inventor ran it. They were men who put money into a business in order to own it, and who possessed both the capital and the institutional patience to wait out the long sales cycles of government contracts, cycles measured in years, during which the company needed continuous financing that only they could supply. The very nature of the arms business, its huge capital requirements, its slow and lumpy government revenues, its need for industrial scale, guaranteed that it would be controlled by finance rather than by invention. It was a business that structurally belonged to whoever could fund the weight, and that was never going to be the mechanic. There is a temptation to read this as Maxim being cheated, and that is not quite right. He was not defrauded. He entered these arrangements with open eyes, and they made him wealthier and more famous than he had ever been. What happened to him was subtler and more instructive than fraud. He was correctly valued by the market for what he was, an extraordinary source of invention, and correctly denied what he was not, a man with capital or the temperament to command it. The market does not punish the inventor out of malice. It simply prices him as an input, and prices the owner of capital as the owner. Maxim's whole life was a long education in that single distinction, and he was learning its most expensive lesson yet. The name on the gun was Maxim. The names that controlled the company sat on the board and in the banks, and they were about to make a decision that would fold Maxim's enterprise into a larger one and bring onto the stage the single most consequential figure in this entire story, a man who never invented anything, who built nothing with his hands, and who would nonetheless end up richer and more powerful than the inventor whose gun he sold. He was a salesman. And in the arms trade, as Maxim was about to learn, the salesman eats first. Chapter 8. The Salesman. His name was Basil Zaharoff, and he is the proof of this entire channel's thesis, because he produced nothing and captured almost everything. Zaharoff's origins are genuinely obscure, deliberately so, and much of what he later told about himself is contested. What can be established is that he emerged in the arms business as a salesman of extraordinary and ruthless gifts, and that his entry point was a rival of Maxim's. On the 14th of October, 1877, Zaharoff was hired by the Swedish arms manufacturer Thorsten Nordenfeldt, whose company made a competing multi-barrel gun and, later, early submarines. Zaharoff's job was to sell Nordenfeldt's weapons to the governments of the world, and at this he proved to be one of the most effective operators the trade had ever seen. His methods are worth describing precisely, because they are the antithesis of everything Maxim represented. Where Maxim built a superior product and trusted it to prove itself in demonstrations, Zaharoff manipulated the conditions under which products were judged. Accounts of the period credit him with a series of maneuvers aimed squarely at undermining Maxim's demonstrations across Europe. At a demonstration in Vienna, Maxim's gun was reportedly sabotaged, with tampered or mismatched cartridges introduced so that the weapon would jam and fail in front of the officers who mattered. At another event, at La Spezia in Italy, Maxim's people were said to have been diverted and entertained away from the field so that the presentation faltered. In Vienna again, an unnamed figure, widely assumed to be Zaharoff, reportedly worked on senior officers privately, planting the doubt that a gun built by hand in a workshop could ever be mass-produced reliably. Whether or not every one of these specific incidents can be independently confirmed, the pattern they describe is consistent, and it is telling. Zaharoff did not fight Maxim on the quality of the product. He fought him on the terrain of perception, access, and doubt, which is the terrain a salesman controls. Then Zaharoff did something far more significant than sabotaging a few demonstrations. He helped engineer the situation in which the two rival companies were combined, on terms that served the money and the salesmen rather than the inventors. In 1888, Maxim's gun company and Nordenfeldt's firm were merged into a single entity, the Maxim, Nordenfeldt Guns and Ammunition Company. The combination was financed on a large scale, with the Rothschild interests behind a capitalization reported at around £1.9 million, an immense sum for the period, equivalent to a figure in the hundreds of millions in today's money. On paper, it was a marriage of the two leading machine gun makers in the world. In practice, it was a consolidation that concentrated the business into fewer hands, and Nordenfeldt himself, the man whose name was half the company's title, was forced out within about 2 years, reportedly bankrupt. The name stayed. The man went. It was a preview of what would eventually happen to Maxim. Zaharoff, meanwhile, did not go. He rose. Inside the merged enterprise, he made himself indispensable as the man who could actually move the product into the hands of governments, and he did it with a technique that became his signature. He sold to all sides. He would sell a weapon system to one nation, then travel to that nation's rival and sell the same or better to them, using the first sale as the argument for the second, manufacturing on both ends the fear that justified the purchase. The approach was so characteristic that it acquired his name in later accounts, the practice of arming opposing powers simultaneously and profiting from the tension between them. His submarine sales were the textbook case. A boat sold to one Mediterranean power, then the neighboring powers persuaded that they now needed their own to match it. A chain of transactions in which the weapons themselves reportedly barely functioned, and it scarcely mattered, because the product being sold was not really the submarine. It was the fear. Set the two men side by side, because the contrast is the whole point. Maxim was the greater mind, the man who had actually solved the problem of automatic fire, the man whose design would outlive them both and reshape war itself. Zaharoff built nothing, designed nothing, and understood the mechanism of the gun no better than any interested layman needed to. And it was Zaharoff who would end up among the richest men in the world, ennobled, courted by governments, while Maxim was eased toward the exit of the company that bore his name. In the arms trade of that era, distribution beat invention, access beat engineering, and the man who controlled the sale controlled the wealth. Maxim had built the better mousetrap, and had spent his whole life discovering, over and over, that the world does not in fact beat a path to that man's door. It beats a path to the man who owns the road. It is worth dwelling on how completely Zaharoff inverted the values Maxim lived by, because the inversion is the lesson. Maxim's entire identity rested on the truth of what he had made. He wanted, above all, to be credited as the man who had genuinely invented the thing, and his lifelong bitterness came from feeling that credit denied. Zaharoff cared nothing for such credit, and would have regarded the wish for it as a weakness. His stock in trade was not truth, but managed perception. The demonstration diverted, the rival's gun quietly jammed, the fear of a neighbor's fleet planted in a minister's ear. He operated in deliberate obscurity, cultivating a mystery about his origins so thick that even his birthplace and early life remained disputed. And he understood that in the arms trade, information and access were the real weapons, not the guns themselves. Where Maxim built a machine and trusted it to speak, Zaharoff controlled who got to hear it speak, and under what conditions, and against what alternatives. The consequence of that difference compounded over decades into one of the great fortunes of the age. By selling to a nation and then to that nation's rival, by financing his own share purchases out of the commissions those sales generated, Zaharoff turned a talent for persuasion into a permanent claim on the industrial machine. He would end his life ennobled and immensely rich, the archetype of the arms dealer, the man later writers would call the merchant of death and the mystery man of Europe. He had produced nothing that could be held in the hand. He had built no mechanism, drawn no patent, solved no problem of engineering. and he finished richer and more powerful than the inventor whose gun had been the basis of it all. If the story of Maxim is a warning about being the maker and not the owner, the story of Zaharoff is the same warning told from the winning side. The gun itself, however, was about to make an argument no salesman could improve on and no rival could sabotage. It was about to be used in the field, against massed human beings, and what it did there would settle forever the question of whether Maxim had built something that worked. Chapter 9. Whatever happens, we have got. The gun's first serious work was done not in a European war between comparable powers, but in the colonial campaigns of the British Empire, against enemies who had no equivalent weapon, and it is there that the true nature of the product became visible. The setting was southern Africa, in the territory that would become Rhodesia during the First Matabele War of 1893 and 1894. In late 1893, columns of the British South Africa Company, the chartered corporation through which Cecil Rhodes was extending British control, came into direct conflict with the Matabele kingdom of Lobengula, whose army was large, disciplined, and brave. At an engagement on the Shangani River, and shortly after at the Bembezi, small forces of company troops equipped with a handful of Maxim guns faced Matabele attacks in the thousands. The precise numbers vary between accounts and should be treated as approximate rather than exact, but the shape is consistent across them. A few dozen to a few score of men, with something on the order of 4 to 5 Maxim guns, broke the assault of forces many times their size, inflicting immense casualties while suffering very few. The arithmetic of those battles is the entire colonial story in miniature. The Matabele warriors were not deficient in courage. Accounts describe them advancing repeatedly into fire that no amount of bravery could survive. The Maxim guns did not care about courage. They delivered a rate of fire that turned the open ground before them into a zone no massed body of men could cross and live. A weapon that let a few dozen men annihilate a few thousand was not, in the imperial context, a military tool like other military tools. It was a machine for making a small number of colonizers the physical masters of a large number of colonized people, which was the precise problem the British Empire existed to solve. The gun had found the customer it was built for. The pattern repeated within days at the Bembezi, where again a small lagered force with a handful of Maxim guns broke repeated assaults by the Matabele regiments and inflicted casualties out of all proportion to their own. Across these engagements, the ratio of dead is the only statistic that matters, and it ran into the hundreds of the attackers for a mere handful of the defenders. The commanders of these columns understood exactly what had happened, and said so. The gun had made the difference between a small expedition being overwhelmed and a small expedition conquering a kingdom. Lobengula's state, which had stood as a regional power, was broken, and the territory took the name of the man whose chartered company had sent the guns, Rhodes, becoming Rhodesia. A commercial enterprise had used a commercial weapon to seize a country, and the weapon was Maxim's. State the reframe that the imperial celebration of the period carefully avoided. What happened in Rhodesia was not, in any meaningful military sense, a battle between two armies. It was the industrial processing of brave men who had no answer to the machine in front of them. The courage was entirely real and entirely irrelevant, and that irrelevance was the whole product. Maxim had built a device that removed courage, numbers, and skill from the equation and replaced them with a single variable: possession of the gun. Whoever had it won. Whoever lacked it died. There is no more complete competitive advantage in the history of commerce, and it was being demonstrated, in blood, as the ultimate advertisement. Word of this spread, and it spread in a form that made the gun famous in a way no advertisement could. The writer, Hilaire Belloc, captured the whole logic of the period in a couplet that has outlived almost everything else written about these campaigns. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Read that as the marketing slogan it effectively became. In 2 lines, it states the value proposition of the entire product. Possession of this weapon, by one side and not the other, decides the outcome regardless of anything else, regardless of numbers, regardless of terrain, regardless of courage. Whatever happens. That is as complete a statement of monopoly advantage as any business has ever been handed, and it was written about Maxim's design. The demonstration that fixed the gun's reputation permanently came on the 2nd of September, 1898, at Omdurman, on the Nile in the Sudan. A British-led Anglo-Egyptian army under General Horatio Herbert Kitchener, numbering in the region of 25,000 to 26,000 men, faced the army of the Khalifa Abdullah, the successor to the Mahdist state that had defeated and killed General Gordon at Khartoum 13 years earlier. The Mahdist force is generally estimated at around 50,000. Kitchener's force was equipped with modern artillery, gunboats on the river, magazine rifles, and a substantial number of Maxim machine guns. What happened in the space of roughly 5 hours was less a battle than a demonstration of what industrial firepower does to men crossing open ground on foot. The Mahdist army advanced in great massed formations across the plain, into the combined fire of artillery, rifles, and Maxim guns firing from fixed positions. They were cut down before they could close. The casualty figures on record describe an almost incomprehensible imbalance. On the Mahdist side, something in the region of 10 to 12,000 men were killed, with roughly another 13,000 wounded and thousands taken prisoner. On the British and Egyptian side, the dead numbered on the order of 47 or 48, with several hundred wounded. 12,000 against 47. That is not the arithmetic of combat between two armies. It is the arithmetic of a machine processing a crowd. Among the young officers present that day was a 23-year-old lieutenant and part-time war correspondent named Winston Churchill, who rode in the charge of the 21st Lancers, and later wrote about the engagement in terms that struggled to reconcile the scale of the killing with any older idea of soldierly glory. The charge of the Lancers, a few hundred horsemen against a concealed mass of Mahdist infantry, earned 3 Victoria Crosses, and became one of the last celebrated cavalry actions of the British Army. But the charge was a sideshow. The real work of Omdurman was done by the guns, standing in their positions, feeding belts of ammunition into a plain full of advancing men, and the lesson was not lost on the more thoughtful witnesses. Something had changed in the nature of war, and the something had a name, and much of it traced back to a workshop in Hatton Garden. State the business reality underneath the horror, because that is this account's job. Omdurman was, among other things, the single most effective product demonstration in the history of the arms trade. No staged firing at saplings on a testing ground could argue what a battlefield argued. After Omdurman, no war ministry on earth could pretend not to understand what the Maxim pattern did to massed infantry in the open. The gun had proven itself in the only laboratory that counted, and the proof was written in a casualty ratio of hundreds to 1. Every government that had hesitated now had its answer, and the orders that followed, for Maxim pattern guns and the rivers of ammunition they consumed, flowed to the company that held the design. And here, the deepest irony of the whole story begins to close, though it would take another 2 decades and a world war to close completely. The victory that made the Maxim gun immortal, the campaigns that made it the most famous weapon of the age, made the inventor himself increasingly beside the point. The gun no longer needed Maxim. It had become a system, an industry, a fixture of every serious army's plans. A system does not need its inventor. It needs owners, financiers, and salesmen. Maxim had built something so successful that it had outgrown him, and a thing that has outgrown its maker does not, as a rule, keep its maker at the center of the money. The men who controlled the company had watched the gun conquer a continent. They were about to decide that the founder was no longer essential to the enterprise that carried his name. Chapter 10. Vickers, Sons, and Maxim. In 1897, the arrangement that had governed Maxim's commercial life reached its logical conclusion. The Maxim Nordenfelt Company was acquired by Vickers, the great Sheffield steel and armaments concern, and folded into a new entity styled Vickers, Sons, and Maxim. On the surface, this looked like an honor. The inventor's name was placed in the title of one of the largest arms manufacturers in the world, alongside the Vickers name itself. In substance, it was the next stage of his separation from control of his own creation. Consider what the acquisition actually did to the ownership structure. Maxim had never controlled the company that bore his name. The financiers had. Now that company was absorbed into a far larger one, controlled by the Vickers interests, in which Maxim's personal stake and personal influence were smaller still relative to the whole. He received value for the transaction, as a shareholder does. He kept a senior position and the prestige of his name in the corporate title. But the distance between Maxim the man and Maxim the brand, which had existed from the very first day the Maxim Gun Company took outside capital in 1884, now widened into a gulf. The name had become an asset of the enterprise. The man had become an employee of it, distinguished but dispensable. The figure who profited most from the new arrangement was, once again, not the inventor. Basil Zaharoff, having come into the combined business through the Nordenfelt side, continued his rise inside Vickers, and the mechanism of that rise is worth understanding precisely because it is a lesson in how ownership actually moves. Zaharoff was paid substantial commissions on the sales he generated, and the sales he generated were enormous. He used that stream of commission income to buy shares in the enterprise. Sales produced cash, cash bought equity, and equity is ownership. Over time, by this patient conversion of his selling into stock, Zaharoff built a holding that reportedly rivaled Maxim's own, and he moved steadily toward the center of control, eventually taking a place among the directing figures of the company after Maxim's departure. Watch the two curves cross. Maxim's curve was the curve of the founder whose contribution had already been made and priced. His invention was in the past. He could improve it, defend the patents, and lend his name, but his fundamental value to the enterprise had been fixed at the moment the design existed, and from there his influence could only decline as the company grew larger and his relative stake grew smaller. Zaharov's curve ran the opposite way. His contribution was ongoing, renewed with every sale, and he converted each renewal into a permanent claim on the business. The inventor's stake was a fixed quantity being diluted. The salesman's stake was a growing quantity being accumulated. It was only ever going to end one way. Notice what the company chose to keep and what it chose to shed, because the choice is the whole lesson of the transaction. It kept the name. The title, Vickers, Sons, and Maxim, placed the inventor's surname in the corporate identity of a giant, not as a courtesy, but because the name was a valuable and specific asset, a mark that meant, to every war ministry on Earth, the proven automatic gun. It kept the patents, the design, the manufacturing base at Crayford, the trained workforce, the reputation earned at Omdurman. What it did not need to keep, in any controlling sense, was the man. The distinction between Maxim the asset and Maxim the person had been latent in the business since 1884, when the first outside capital came in. The 1897 acquisition simply made it explicit and permanent. From that point, the enterprise held everything of Maxim's that could be owned, and the only thing left outside its ownership was Maxim himself, an aging engineer with a diminishing stake and a seat that the company could dispense with whenever it chose. The financiers had, over 13 years, quietly completed the separation of the inventor from his invention. And they had done it not by any single act of betrayal, but by the ordinary, lawful, relentless logic of who contributes capital and who merely contributed an idea. It ended with Maxim's exit. In 1911, at the age of 71, Maxim resigned from the board of the company. The reasons given at the time and since include his age and declining health, and those were real. But the structural story sits underneath the personal one. A founder who does not control his company is retained for as long as he is useful and eased out when he is not, and by 1911 the enterprise had everything Maxim had ever given it. It had the design, the patents, the manufacturing base, the global reputation, and above all the name, which it kept. What it no longer particularly needed was the aging man who had done the original work. So he went, and the company carried on, and in time even the name would be quietly dropped from the title, absorbed and then discarded once its value had been fully extracted. This is the brand versus company distinction stated in its harshest form. A brand is precisely the part of a founder that a company can keep after it has finished with the founder himself. Maxim the man walked out of the boardroom in 1911. Maxim the name stayed on the guns, on the contracts, on the corporate letterhead, generating value for owners who were no longer him. The separation that had begun as a financing arrangement in 1884 was now complete. The company had successfully extracted the one thing it needed from the inventor, his design and his name, and had shed everything else, including the inventor. But the design itself was about to do something that neither Maxim nor Zaharov nor Vickers fully controlled. It was about to escape the company altogether, copied and adapted by the war ministries of rival nations, until the same fundamental mechanism, born in a London workshop, sat in the arsenals of powers preparing to fight each other. The gun was becoming everybody's gun, and everybody was about to point it at the same generation of young men. Chapter 11. Everybody's gun. A design that becomes the standard stops belonging to the man who drew it. This is true of every foundational invention, and it was true of Maxim's. By the turn of the century, the automatic machine gun was no longer a Maxim novelty. It was a category, and the category had Maxim's fingerprints on every example, because every serious army that wanted such a weapon started from the mechanism he had pioneered, the harnessing of recoil to make the gun feed and fire itself. The clearest case is Germany. The German army, having examined the Maxim gun in the 1890s and reportedly seen it demonstrated before the Kaiser, adopted the Maxim pattern and then set about producing its own version through German industry. The result was the Maschinengewehr 08, the Meters G08, adopted in 1908, manufactured in Germany at the government arsenal at Spandau and by private firms, and built directly on Maxim's recoil-operated, water-cooled, belt-fed principle. It was, in every respect that mattered, a German-made Maxim. When the German army went to war in 1914, its heavy machine gun was a lineal descendant of the design an American had built in a London workshop 3 decades earlier. The British case runs exactly parallel, from the other side of what would become the front line. Vickers, the company that had absorbed Maxim and his gun, refined the original design into a lighter, more reliable weapon, and the British Army adopted this improved version, the Vickers gun, around 1912. The Vickers was Maxim's mechanism, lightened and perfected by the firm that owned his patents and carried his name in its title. It would serve the British Army as its standard medium machine gun for an astonishing span, remaining in service for over half a century, long after the man who fathered its mechanism was dead and his name had been dropped from the company. So consider the position by 1912, 2 years before the catastrophe. The British Army's standard machine gun was a Maxim derivative. The German Army's standard machine gun was a Maxim derivative. Both descended from the same recoil-operated action, both traced to the same inventor, both manufactured by great industrial concerns that had turned his design into a national arsenal. The gun had propagated so completely that the two most powerful armies in Europe would go to war carrying, in effect, the same weapon, each pointed at the other. There had already been a warning of what this meant when modern armies fought each other rather than colonial opponents. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, both sides fielded machine guns, largely of the Maxim pattern, and observers from every major army were present to watch. What they saw was a preview of the Western Front. Attacks by brave, well-led infantry against positions defended by machine guns failed with appalling loss. The gun that had cut down massed warriors at Omdurman did the same thing to disciplined modern soldiers advancing in the open. Because the gun does not distinguish between a modest spearman and a Russian conscript, it denies the ground to human bodies, whoever they belong to. Military attachés wrote reports. Some of the lessons were absorbed. Many were not, or were absorbed and then set aside by armies still wedded to the belief that sufficient courage and sufficient numbers could carry a position. That belief was about to be tested on a scale the world had never seen. The failure to absorb the lesson was not a failure of information. The information was abundant, and it was recent. Attachés had watched machine guns break infantry assaults in Manchuria in 1904 and 1905. Officers had seen, at Omdurman and across the colonial wars, what sustained automatic fire did to men crossing open ground. The evidence had been accumulating for 2 full decades, from the Shangani in 1893 through the Russo-Japanese War, and it all pointed the same way. The gun had made the frontal assault across open ground, the oldest and proudest maneuver of European infantry, into a form of mass suicide. What failed was not the gathering of the evidence, but the willingness of institutions to accept a conclusion that overturned everything their doctrine, their training, and their sense of soldierly honor was built on. Armies are not, as a rule, quick to believe that the thing they are best at has become the thing that will get their men killed. So they filed the reports, adopted the guns, and marched in 1914 with tactics that the guns had already rendered obsolete. The weapon had outrun the doctrine by a generation, and the gap between them would be filled with bodies. The reframe here is the coldest one in the whole story. Maxim had set out, back in 1881, to build a weapon that would let Europeans, in the words of the man who advised him, cut each other's throats with greater facility. For 20 years, the gun had mostly cut the throats of people the Europeans were conquering, in Africa and Asia. But the design had now spread into the arsenals of the European powers themselves, evenly, on all sides, so that when those powers finally turned on one another, the advice would be fulfilled in its most literal and terrible form. The Europeans were about to cut each other's throats, with great facility, using the same machine, and the man who built it would live just long enough to see it begin. Nobody owned the outcome now. Not Maxim, not Zaharoff, not Vickers, not the German arsenals. The design had escaped all of them and become a fixed feature of how the 20th century would kill. And in the summer of 1914, the bill for 30 years of that design's spread came due all at once. Chapter 12. Both sides of the line. When the armies of Europe marched in August of 1914, they carried with them, on every side, the perfected descendants of the gun from Hatton Garden. Within months, the war of movement collapsed into a war of entrenchment. And the reason it collapsed was, more than any other single factor, the machine gun. 2 lines of trenches ran from the Channel to the Swiss border, and between them lay a strip of ground that no man could cross in daylight and live, because that ground was covered by belt-fed, water-cooled automatic guns firing hundreds of rounds a minute from fixed, protected positions. Maxim had built a machine for denying ground to human beings. Now the whole continent was divided by a 4-year-long demonstration of exactly that. The German Meters G08 and the British Vickers faced each other across no man's land for the entire war, 2 versions of the same invention firing into the young men sent against them. When British infantry went over the top toward the German lines, they advanced into the fire of Maxim-derived Meters G08 guns. When German infantry attacked the British lines, they advanced into the fire of Maxim-derived Vickers guns. The symmetry is total, and it is monstrous. The single design was killing both armies at once, its owners on each side collecting on the same fundamental patent lineage, its inventor's mechanism doing to a generation of Europeans precisely what it had done to the Matabele and the Mahdists on an industrial continental scale. The date that fixes this in the record is the 1st of July, 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. On that single day, the British Army suffered around 57,000 casualties, of whom roughly 19,000 were killed. It remains the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. A large share of that slaughter was the work of German machine guns, Meters G08s, firing from positions the preliminary bombardment had failed to destroy, catching lines of British infantry as they walked across open ground toward the German wire. The men fell in rows. The gun did what it had always done, what it had done at the Shangani and at Omdurman, what Maxim had designed it to do in a London workshop in 1884. It made the crossing of open ground by masked men statistically fatal, and it did so with perfect indifference to whose men they were. Hold on the mechanics of that first day, because they show the gun doing exactly and only what it was designed to do. The British plan had assumed that a week-long artillery bombardment would destroy the German defenses and cut the wire, so that the infantry could walk across and occupy the ruins. The bombardment failed to do either in many places. The German machine gunners, sheltered in deep dugouts, waited out the shelling, and when it lifted and the British infantry rose and advanced across no man's land, the gunners carried their meters GO8s up the steps, mounted them, and fired into ranks of men walking toward them in the open at a measured pace. The result was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was the gun performing its single function against the largest available supply of targets. 20,000 British dead in a day is not a figure that describes a contest. It describes a harvest, gathered by the mechanism from Hatton Garden, working precisely as its inventor had built it to work. Put the two numbers from this story next to each other, because the whole account has been building toward the comparison. At Omdurman in 1898, the gun helped kill roughly 12,000 men in an afternoon, and the world called it a triumph of civilization over barbarism, a demonstration of imperial superiority. 18 years later, on the Somme, the same gun helped kill and wound tens of thousands of British men in a day, and there was no comfortable story left to tell about it, because now the dead were the sons of the nation that had built and celebrated the weapon. The gun had not changed. Only the identity of the men in front of it had changed. That was the true cost of the design, and it had always been implicit in it. A machine that annihilates whoever crosses the open ground will, once everyone owns it, annihilate everyone's sons. This is the cost the promise at the beginning of this account said would eventually be named, and here it is, named plainly. The cost of Maxim's design was not paid by Maxim, and it was not paid by Zaharoff, and it was not paid by the shareholders of Vickers, all of whom did well out of it. It was paid, in the end, by a generation of young men on both sides of a line in France and Belgium, cut down by a weapon so evenly distributed among the powers that it gave no side victory, and only guaranteed the mutual destruction its creator's earliest patron had, with grim accuracy, predicted in Paris in 1881. And while that generation was being scythed down in the summer and autumn of 1916, the man whose mind had produced the mechanism was dying quietly, an old man in a house in South London, largely deaf, his fortune made, his name being folded away into the archives of the company that had used him. He would not live to see the war end. He would die in the middle of it, in the very season the guns built from his design were doing their worst work, and the coincidence of that timing is the last and heaviest irony this story has to offer. Chapter 13. The Captive Flying Machine. The final act of Maxim's life reads, at first, like a series of eccentric footnotes, and becomes, when one looks closely, the fitting close to a story about a man who was always the maker and never the owner. Long before the war, Maxim had turned much of his restless, inventive energy toward flight. Beginning around 1889, he poured a great deal of his own money into building an enormous flying machine, a craft with a wingspan of over 100 feet, weighing several tons, powered by two lightweight steam engines of his own design, generating hundreds of horsepower, running on a dedicated track at a property at Baldwin's Park in Bexley, on the southeastern edge of London. In 1894, the great machine, during a trial, generated enough lift to leave its track before being deliberately restrained, and Maxim could fairly claim to have built a powered machine capable of raising itself and its crew off the ground, years before the Wright brothers achieved controlled, sustained flight. But he had not solved control, which was the actual problem of flight. And the project, for all the money it consumed, led nowhere commercially. It was Maxim in miniature, a genuine technical achievement that captured him no fortune and no lasting credit, because achievement without control of the outcome had always been his particular fate. The engineering was real. He had built a machine of several tons that generated enough lift to rise from its track, powered by steam engines of a lightness that was itself a considerable achievement, and he had done it a decade before the Wright brothers flew. But he had chased lift, the part he could solve with power and mechanism, and had not solved control, the part that actually mattered. And so the whole enormous effort produced no aircraft, no patent of lasting commercial value, and no place in the history of flight beyond a footnote. Once again, he had been the man who could build the thing without being the man who captured its worth. What his flight experiments did eventually produce was not an aircraft, but an amusement park ride. Around 1904, the apparatus of his aeronautical work was reworked into the Captive Flying Machine, a fairground attraction installed at Earl's Court in London, in which paying customers sat in cars that swung outward as they spun. It was popular. It made money as entertainment where it had failed as aviation. There is something almost unbearably apt in it. The man who had armed the British Empire, whose design was even then being built into the machine guns of every great power, ended his inventive career watching the public pay to ride the repurposed bones of his greatest personal dream, spun in circles for amusement at a London exhibition ground. His personal life carried the same pattern of contribution unrewarded and credit lost. He had spent decades estranged from his younger brother, Hiram Maxim, himself a talented inventor who worked on explosives and propellants, the two men divided by a bitter and lasting dispute over patents and priority, a smaller and more personal version of the credit wars that had defined Hiram's life. The dispute with Hudson was not a trivial family quarrel. Hiram Maxim was a genuinely capable inventor in his own right, working on explosives and propellants, and the two brothers fell out permanently over questions of patent and priority in that field, each convinced the other had taken what was his. That two brothers, both gifted inventors, should destroy their relationship over the ownership of credit is the clearest possible sign of how central that particular wound was to Hiram's character. He had lost the credit for the electric light to a stranger and could not forgive it. And he would lose his brother over the same currency of credit and priority, and could not forgive that either. The pattern was not incidental to his life. It was his life, played out from the light bulb to the family dinner table. There was one more turn of the same wheel, and it fell to the next generation. His son, Hiram Percy Maxim, was himself a serious engineer, a pioneer of the early automobile and of amateur radio, and his most famous invention was a device to muffle the noise of a firearm, the suppressor that carried the family name, the Maxim silencer. Set the two men's signature products side by side. The father built the gun that made the loudest and most terrible noise of the industrial age, the sound of massed automatic fire that defined modern war. The son built the device to quiet the gun. The family that had given the world its most efficient machine for killing at a distance also gave it the means to make that killing silent, and both inventions carried the same surname into the catalogs of the arms trade. Maxim had been made deaf, by many accounts, by years of exposure to the gun he had built, a quiet physical toll extracted by his own creation. Late in life, he turned his inventiveness to a menthol inhaler for bronchitis and other modest domestic devices, and he wrote and spoke, defending his claims to the inventions he felt others had taken from him, still fighting, at the end, the same battle over credit he had been fighting since the days of the electric light. He died on the 24th of November, 1916, at his home in Streatham, in South London, aged 76. The Battle of the Somme had ground to its exhausted close only days before. The war his weapon had helped to freeze into 4 years of slaughter had more than 2 years left to run. His name was still in the title of the company, though its practical association with him had ended when he left the board in 1911. And in the years to come, the Maxim name would be dropped from the corporate identity altogether, folded into Vickers and then into the successor firms that carried the British arms industry through the century. The gun would outlive him by generations. The Vickers version of his design would serve the British Army until the 1960s, nearly 80 years after he first built the mechanism in Hatton Garden. Set against his story, consider the man who had sold the gun. Basil Zaharoff, who invented nothing, ended the First World War as one of the wealthiest men in the world, honored by governments, knighted by the British crown he had enriched, his fortune swollen by the very war that had killed the generation Maxim's design cut down. The salesman had converted a lifetime of selling other men's weapons into a vast personal empire of capital, while the inventor had converted a lifetime of unmatched invention into a comfortable retirement and a name that his own company would eventually discard. The two curves that had crossed inside the boardroom stayed crossed to the grave and beyond. That is where the ledger, opened in the very first minute of this account, is finally totaled. It remains only to add up what each of the decisions in this story actually cost, and to whom. Conclusion. The ledger. Total up the account. One self-taught mechanic from Maine, with fewer than 5 years of schooling and a first patent for a hair-curling iron. Some 122 American patents and roughly 149 British ones. One electric light business lost, in the public memory, to Edison. One machine gun, built in 18 months in a rented London workshop, capable of 600 rounds a minute, the firepower of 30 men from a single position. One company founded, financed by other men, merged, absorbed, and renamed, until the founder's own name was folded away. One knighthood. One salesman who never invented anything and died among the richest men on earth. 2 colonial wars won by lopsided slaughter. 2 world wars fought, on all sides, with the same design. And, at the far end of it, a generation of young men cut down across a strip of ground in France by the perfected descendants of a gun an American had built to sell to Europeans who did not, at first, even want it. The gap between those things is where the business story actually lives, not in the gun, which was only ever evidence, in the distance between the man who invented, the design that outlived and escaped him, and the cost that neither he nor the men who profited from it ever had to pay themselves. Restate the decisions, each as the market problem it solved. The decision to leave America solved the problem of a market that valued publicity over invention and had already handed his best work to a better promoter. The decision to abandon electricity for weapons solved the problem of finding a customer with infinite money and no price sensitivity, and that customer was war. The decision to harness recoil solved the problem of the man embedded in the machine and turned a crank-powered gun into a self-feeding one. The decision to standardize on the Army's own cartridge solved the problem of adoption and built a logistical lock-in no competitor could easily break. Each decision was sound. Each one worked. Each one moved the value further from the inventor and closer to the men who owned the enterprise. Then restate the errors, each as a business decision made once and paid for later. The error was never technical. Maxim's engineering was, by the standards of his age, close to flawless. The error was structural, and it was the same error, repeated. Every time he needed capital, he took it on terms that traded control for money, and control, once traded away, does not come back. He accepted outside financing in 1884 and never again commanded the company that bore his name. He let his stake be diluted through merger in 1888 and acquisition in 1897, while the salesman beside him converted commissions into ownership. He was the indispensable man right up until the moment the system he had built no longer needed him, and then, in 1911, he was simply gone, and the enterprise did not miss a step. The cost of being the maker and never the owner was the whole enterprise, extracted from him one financing round at a time. The name survived because it was precise. Maxim did not mean, to a war ministry, a vague reputation for quality. It meant a specific thing: the automatic gun, the mechanism that had proven itself from the Shangani to Omdurman, the design every rival army was forced to imitate. That precision was an asset, and an asset can be owned by someone other than the man who created it. So the name stayed on the guns and in the company title after the man left, doing its work for the shareholders, until even the name had given all the value it had and was quietly retired into the larger corporate machine of the British arms industry. The man was mortal and was dismissed. The brand was property and was kept, exactly as long as it paid, and no longer. There is a final accounting to make, the one the whole story has been keeping, and it concerns who paid and who did not. Maxim did not pay. He died wealthy, knighted, and comfortable, whatever bitterness he carried about credit. The financiers did not pay. They collected on every stage of the enterprise: the founding, the merger, the acquisition, and the war. Zaharoff did not pay. He ended among the richest men alive. The names on the contracts, the shareholders, the directors, the arms firms of every combatant nation, none of them paid. The gun that had made all of them money did its most terrible work on people who had signed nothing and owned nothing of it: the warriors on the plains of Africa and, in the end, the young men of Europe. That is the structure of the entire arms trade laid bare in one life. The people who decide, invent, finance, and sell are almost never the people who pay. And the distance between those two groups is exactly the distance between a boardroom in London and a strip of churned ground in France. The person who understood all of this best was never Maxim. It was the man who advised him at the Paris exhibition in 1881, the stranger who told him to stop building light and start building the means for Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility. That was not cynicism. It was, as the following 35 years proved with terrible exactness, the single most accurate piece of market analysis in this entire story. The demand was real. The demand was permanent. And the bill for meeting it was paid, in the end, not by the inventor, and not by the financiers, and not by the salesman, but by the men who fell in rows in front of the gun, on every side, until there were no comfortable stories left to tell about any of it. If you want to understand how a design can outlive the man who drew it, enrich the men who never drew anything, arm the empire that would not at first have him, and cut down a generation that had nothing to do with any of the decisions that built it, Hiram Maxim is the case to study.